Writing was invented first by the Sumerians. And sure enough, it developed rapidly. And because the system, because the idea is already there, somebody else who comes along and doesn't have a writing system says, well, this is amazing. You look at this and you can represent what you say. And that's why Egyptian writing starts shortly thereafter. We know that Egypt and Sumer did have interrelationships about that time. And there are many elements in early Egyptian civilization which indicate influence from Sumer.
Does anyone know how to talk
Sumerian?
Sumerian?
Look, I remember Professor Kramer speaking. He was giving an address, and he said, look, I can speak Sumerian. He says, if there were a Sumerian scribe and priest standing up here and he heard me, he would say, Dr. Kramer, you have a funny accent. He says, but I know what I'm saying. Yes, there are people who can read Sumerian. Of course, there's no one to speak to. So the way you can read it. They can read it and understand it quite clearly, because there have been, over the period of 100 years, there have been a lot of opportunity to check and recheck and eliminate errors until finally they were able to master it. The same thing happened with Babylonian and Egyptian. Egyptian was easier to decipher, but Babylonian required, 20 years of decipherment until they finally were certain. In fact, the Royal Asiatic Society had their doubts, so they took a few Babylonian tablets which had never been seen before, and they gave it out to 4 people who claimed that they could read Babylonian. And they all translated them, and then they presented their translations, and lo and behold, they were all right. They were all correct. So they know how to read Babylonian. My teacher, Cyrus Gordon, is a world expert on it. He could read Babylonian fluently. I could read it slowly, but it takes time. Let's get back to this. Now, writing was invented then around 3500 BC. It was Sumerian, and the Sumerians, shortly after the invention of writing, which they did for practical purposes, to draw up contracts and to draw up bills of sale and definitions of property and so on, they began to record their literature. By literature, and again, the word literature in itself means letters and it means writing, but the fact is that poetry and prose is older by thousands of years than writing. So there was poetry, there was prose, there were stories that already existed. Now they could be recorded. And some of the earliest poems and stories are in Sumerian. And one of my favorite poems, probably the earliest story ever written in poetic form, is the Gilgamesh epic. And the Gilgamesh epic is probably the first literary work ever written in the Sumerian language, and already has in it some of the most modern philosophical ideas, because certain problems affected human beings all the time, and they don't differ today from how they affected human beings thousands of years ago. I mean, there's one section of the Gilgamesh epic in which I notated in the margins exact parallels between the story as told, or the arguments in the Gilgamesh epic, and a book written by Sigmund Freud in 1900 called Civilization and Its Discontents. Between Civilization and Its Discontent by Sigmund Freud and the Gilgamesh epic, first tablet, you have the exact same problems presented and the exact same dilemmas presented. The earliest versions we have of the Gilgamesh epic in Sumerian date from about 2500 BC, but that's all we found. These are the tablets. The most complete Gilgamesh epic we have is Babylonian, and it dates from about 1000 BC. But that's already a later version, and it's an expansion and translation of the Sumerian into Babylonian. That's the most complete, because that was found in the library of Ashurbanipal, and was probably rewritten. It was probably copied down around 700 BC or something like that, but it's much earlier. From the words and the names and the ideas, we know that. And by the way, in the Sumerian version of Gilgamesh, we have already 2 versions, 2 different characters, to different, what shall we call them, the heroes and so on. So then the story existed, and it was written in different forms. Now, the Sumerian civilization flourished from its beginning, probably before 4000 BC, until about 2700 or 2800 BC, when a new population came into the, or a new population became dominant in the country. Now, I don't say they had already been there, and we have no idea as to the method which brought them there, but I think, my feeling is that there was a gradual infiltration, a gradual migration of these people into the Sumerian region, because Sumer was a great civilized society. It was the wealthy country. And so people from the fringes began to move in, and by 2700 BC, a group, we call them the Akkadians, the Akkadians are already in the country. They speak an entirely different language. The Akkadians speak a language which we call later, it's the same language, we call it Babylonian. The Akkadians speak Akkadian, which we call Babylonian. And sometimes, you know, there are scholars who will say up to a certain date we call it Akkadian, after that we call it Babylonian, but it's the same language. Now, Babylonian is entirely different from Sumerian. Babylonian is a Semitic language. It's related to Hebrew. If you know Hebrew, you can read Babylonian in transliteration, of course, but the Babylonians used exactly the same writing system as the Sumerians. They adopted their writing system. So it's the Sumerian writing system which was adopted by the Akkadians and the Babylonians, and later the Assyrians and the Armenians and the Persians and the Hurrians. There were 8 different languages that were written, all using the Sumerian system. Because once you have a phonetic writing system, it's adaptable to any language. I mean, that's the beauty of writing. You can write a language in a certain system, let's say the Latin alphabet. We use the Latin alphabet for English. We use it for probably 1,000 other languages, maybe 2,000 languages. Any writing system can be used for any language. So they adopted that. Now, what is the advantage of the Sumerian Babylonian writing system? Because they wrote on clay, and clay was the cheapest and most abundant material, they created a system of writing which we call cuneiform, because essentially they had a lump of clay, smoothed it out, and then impressed, they had probably a wooden stick with a square edge, and they impressed it into the wet clay, and so they created wedges, cone-shaped impressions. And by combining these wedges, by combining them, they created the symbols. But they created what we call a syllabary, that is a system of writing in which each symbol represents a syllable. And because it's a syllabary, you need hundreds of them.